So my name is Erik Herrmann, and I teach architecture at the Knowlton School of Architecture at The Ohio State University, and I'm co-director of Outpost office. You know, I think that anyone who goes into architecture goes into it with a little bit of naivete, so I certainly was interested in buildings and how things were assembled. I really enjoyed geometry. I liked art and mathematics, so their intersection seemed really promising. I looked at a lot of different programs when I got into architecture. I mean, as I said, I was a little bit naive about what it was really about, but I did know that I was interested in building. And I always, as a kid, I was really interested in how things came together. I would take things apart a lot, all these kind of like classic stereotypes of the kind of architect's mind. And so when it came time to go to school, I looked at a lot of different places, and I interviewed some places, and my parents were really great about, like, we took these road trips to kind of visit where I might go to school. But I ended up essentially staying home and going to the University of Tennessee. So at the time, it was led by Marlene K. Davis, who was a dean she had spent time at Syracuse and Cornell, I think, a little bit. And she just had a really clear vision for what she wanted to do with the school. She had hired a lot of really exciting people. And then from a practical standpoint, I grew up in a family with 3 kids, and it was free to go to Tennessee. So it was a great school. And then there were those practical things that you couldn't kind of ignore. So I chose to go there. And I think that the way I made the decision is different than the way students make the decision today. I think students are much more informed about the programs that they're going to because they have access to that kind of information. There was no, I age myself here, but no like Facebook or Instagram where I could I guess there was Facebook, but there was no Instagram to look and see what these different programs were doing and how they advertise themselves. And I remember sending away for a catalog or some kind of material from Cornell to learn what they were doing there. Same thing with Rice and other schools. And so I think schools marketed themselves in a very different way. And then I didn't have any guidance to go on. I think I got one of those design intelligence rankings and looked at that. I mean, a really kind of bereft of information. So, but I think that helped because I think the choice would have been harder if I knew all the exciting things happen other places. But then when I got to Tennessee, it was completely fantastic, and I got to discover what was there on my own, which was a really great place and the right fit for me. So I guess that's the most important thing.
And what about grad school? How did you decide to go?
Yeah, so when it came time to go to grad school, so I got a 5-year degree at the University of Tennessee. So I had an accredited degree and I could practice. And I practiced for a couple of years after school. I graduated during the recession. So, there's a lot of challenging markets, but that was a particularly challenging one. And I was fortunate to find work in Louisiana. It was just a place that was hiring. So I went to Trahan Architects, and they were in Baton Rouge at that point. And I worked there for a couple of years, and I just spent a lot of time talking with the people at the firm about where they had gone to school and learning more. I reached out to friends of friends who had gone to different schools. And Yale was on my radar from a pretty early point. It was, generally admired by a lot of the folks that had been my educators. So that was kind of reinforcing it. And then I felt it was a place where having a 5-year degree, I felt a little anxious about maybe, although I had wonderful instruction in history and theory at Tennessee, I still felt a little anxious about maybe going back and using the degree as an opportunity to get a broader perspective on the discipline and on the field of architecture. And Yale has a really robust set of seminars that were really exciting for me. And I think I went to the school for that first and for the studio structure second. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I have a natural nostalgia for almost every place I've lived, and in almost all those instances, it's probably more about the people than the architecture. But I was actually born in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which I have really no memory of because my family moved about 8 times before I started in kind of grade school. And so my home was Tennessee. That's really where I grew up. That's where I went to school. That's where I experienced a lot of firsts in my life. And I grew up in Knoxville, so I grew up in a university town. So it was a nice mix of a small place, but also there was enough culture going on. There's an Edward Larrabee Barnes little white cube gallery downtown, and my parents were really good about taking me to that once in a while, and I would kind of get to see art and things like that. And there was good culture. But I guess if I have to identify a home, it would definitely be Tennessee, but I spent 2 really formative years after Yale in Stuttgart, Germany, and that experience had a certain intensiveness to it. So even though I didn't spend time there very long, and even though my German is atrocious, there's still a little part of me that feels Stuttgart is home as well. And I think that's kind of natural, and I think becoming more and more common as we find ourselves being like more mobile in society and moving around a lot. And I think that being able to identify a lot of different homes at the same time is comforting, and maybe that's a little bit of what Outpost is about. A kind of an idea that maybe if you're constantly moving, you're always at one point or another positioned at the outside. And it gives you kind of perspective on all the great things that you may have left behind, but maybe it also exposes the flaws or things that need to be worked on where you were. So maybe it's a little bit baked into my personal experience too. Yeah, I mean, mentorship is a really essential part of my experience in architecture, and I think that it really started right from the jump in my undergraduate education, where I had a professor, Brian Ambrosiak. So Brian was not from Tennessee, one of the first people that I was educated by that wasn't from where I was from. And Brian had, gone to Princeton, and he had done all this like amazing work. He had worked for Michael Graves, who, I knew a little bit about. And Brian was always very generous about sharing his time and sharing his advice and being a real mentor. And ever since then, I think I've always kind of thrived on finding mentorship in the different places I am. What makes a good mentor is someone who's generous, but also maybe allows you to see also your shortcomings as well. Someone who kind of is very frank with you. And I've been lucky enough to have a series of them at all these different places, and there's some in a professional capacity, some more at school. But architecture is a small field, and it's also enormous at the same time, because there's so many things you can do with an architecture degree. And I think finding your way in architecture is the hardest part about it. I think the education is rigorous, but what it really comes down to is understanding how to take all that and how much of it to leave behind and how much of it to hold close. And so I think mentors are great because, they're not like idols, they're just kind of models of possibilities. And I think that it's just really impossible for me to think about going through architecture without my principal education being learning from others. And often in like more indirect ways. So observing, just how they go about their day, and observing like the things that they value and the things that they thrive on and the things that they use to kind of shape their life. So there are different styles of mentorship, and I think that like someone who really shaped my experience a lot, who it was more a kind of like formal relationship of having them as a professor, was Keller Easterling at Yale. And I think that what was great about Keller is that she always brought your attention not to a thing, but the way the thing impacted the world. I think that's a really important lesson in architecture. Architecture is myopic, and there are kind of fixations, and we get kind of attached to not only the things we're making, but our intentions about them. And I think Keller is really interested, if I could butcher her project a bit, in these ideas of like how things move through the world, right? How things kind of catch fire or don't, how things make impacts that you wouldn't have anticipated. And I think that for me, and I don't want to speak for my generation, but I think for me and a lot of my peers at Yale, where the education was really focused on buildings, and it was an education centered on certain principles of the discipline, Keller offered an expanded view, and a view that I think was radically important to us. And I think it's also a kind of like a good sign of like how influential she's been, is like there's not a lot of like direct quotation of her when we write about these projects. It feels like it's probably deeper. There's something there about the way we approach the work, and certainly the way we look at how work from ourselves and from our peers moves through the world, that attentiveness has to have been forged and shaped, and great classes like her entrepreneurism class launch at Yale, where actually Ashley and I worked together and put together a proposal for agricultural fields in airports. And the premise of the class was really beautiful. It was just this idea that you would kind of use your spatial praxis and your spatial knowledge to produce a proposal that fit more into this parlance of investment and entrepreneurship. And the idea was simply about how to find purchase in that world, but then how to bring a different agenda in along the way, kind of underneath things. And I think that Keller represents, these ideas about being strategic, about being a little circumspect, about looking carefully at the world from a broader vantage than I think most architects do. And it's certainly been really influential. So the research speaks a little bit more to maybe what the kind of tug I felt generationally. So when I was in school, it was kind of the nadir of parametricism and computational design, the way it was understood in the mid 1990s to the early 2000s. So there was a kind of growing awareness that the way computation had been kind of whisked into architecture, and the concern had become more about universalizing of language and an intensity of a kind of certain grammar or a style. People were getting a little suspicious of that, and I had done a little programming and software work when I was in high school, so I always had this kind of interest. But I was always, even though I knew how to do the things to do with computational design, I was always very suspect of it. And I think part of it was that it just felt so monolithic, and it felt a little stifling. And so in my last year at Yale, I had taken a great course on computational design, where the focus had been to look a little bit further afield, to find different ways that architecture and computation could relate. And probably the strength of that course was that it was through the lens of media, where suddenly there was an opportunity to understand how computation was actually changing the formats that we could work in, and it was changing the capacities with which we could design, and it wasn't just suggesting a new stylistic turn. So I was doing research, and I was really convinced that there must be a longer legacy of people looking at computational design in a way that's different than it was in the 1990s. And so I did a little research, and I found that there were two kind of epicenters. One was at Cambridge, where a group in the 1960s had looked at applying computational principles to design. There was actually an entire research center there. A number of interesting people passed through it. And actually Sean Keller, who teaches at IIT, wrote a wonderful piece a few years ago about that center. And then the other one was in Stuttgart, and I couldn't find much information on it. So I basically applied to a series of fellowships. And like everything that I've ever done, I applied to a ton of things and only got one. So I made, the choice was made for me, which I think is great, because ultimately we really try to take that spirit in the work that we do. We really just try all the opportunities we can kind of get our hands on, and we're very, very used to rejection. It's just part of the game. And so I had the opportunity to go to Stuttgart, and I had this suspicion there was something there. And I sat down with Akim Menges the very first day I was there, and he said, I haven't had a lot of time with it, but a colleague down the hall is looking at this guy. You should look at this guy, Max Bense. And Max Bense was a philosopher, and he had something called the Stuttgart School in Stuttgart in the early 1960s. That was a perfect intersection of computation and aesthetics. And essentially, Bense and his colleagues were trying to find formulas for beauty, ways in which the computer could produce beauty, and ways in which it could analyze and understand beauty. And so over the next year, I basically, like a sponge, absorbed all I could. And I'm still processing that research. I wrote a recent piece in Log that was about different models of authorship. And that all extends from the work that I did in Stuttgart. And what's fascinating to look at is that, before this moment in architecture that I had experienced, where computation was kind of labeled one thing, there were these incredible early researchers who were understanding the different forms of authorship that the computer would generate. So they weren't really interested in what computational work was going to look like. What they were interested in is how was the author going to need to change. And for me, I think that that's the central question of our experience with computation still today. The question is, how do we train designers that are prepared for these tools that have increasing discretion? So the black box is continuing to expand, and our ability to understand the older model is to put something in and know what's going to come out, and now we're not putting much in and really strange things are coming out. We're getting to the point with models like machine learning where scientists are getting results that they can't flip around backwards and understand. And so these models have been incredibly illuminating for me, and I've tried to write about them to kind of process for myself what it means for the different models of authorship happening now. And also I've identified in my mind people and peers working in the field that are addressing these issues. So I don't know where this question started, but essentially Stuttgart was a place where I found a series of models of computational design that needed to be dusted off and looked at again. And I've been trying to, since that point, use them as a kind of lens through which to understand the contemporary moment. And it's really amazing to see how prescient a lot of this work was, and how many unanswered questions we still have. The daily routine is different every day, but I kind of thrive on that. So I think a lot of the decisions I've made about the shape that my career has taken, whether it was conscious or not, I've pushed toward the model that we're at now, which is a model where we teach full time. So we have a tremendous responsibility with these amazing students at OSU. So I'm in class, 4 to 5 days a week. And then we structure the other time around the work going on in the office. I was still curious about trying to find how I would answer the question, what is architecture? And I felt like that was something that, for better or for worse, I couldn't really answer in another practice. So as much as I thrived on the structure of working in a firm, and I enjoyed having so many colleagues, and I learned so much, I was always interested in doing something where I could maybe work to answer those questions and be honestly in a format that was made for a little bit more chaos in each day. I really thrive on having a lot of things going on at the same time. And so Ashley and I started working together about the time I finished at Yale. And we did a few competitions together. We wrote things for venues like Clog, the kind of things that you can write in a weekend. These were important venues because we were just working full time. And I think that Outpost Office, more than a practice, it was really important as an idea, something that's outside of ourselves, that we can kind of try to kind of shape, and something that can become about more than just what we're interested in, I would hope, And so we started practicing together, and about that time, Ashley got the fellowship at Michigan, and that quickly really cast the die for the firm in terms of it was a academic practice first, more than anything, right? And through working on her fellowship together and then working subsequently on mine, it became really evident that it was a really good model. We make this joke when we get interviewed. We're always asked how big the firm is, and our answer is always, it's never less than 2. And we really, we feel like, the practice is something that allows us, again, to kind of work outside ourselves, and it grows sometimes when we're able to afford having researchers work with us. But we're very cognizant of making certain that the practice stays, as informal as it's always been. What we're really interested in, what our habit has become, is that we're not big enough to be doing developing a lot of proprietary things, and the firm's research isn't focused on one kind of area. So we've discovered that a lot of the way we work is to take things off the shelf and figure out how to use them in a different way. And I think that makes a lot of sense with an architecture education, because we're not interested in engineering something and how it comes together. We're more interested in the classic architecture trope of like taking the thing and turning it upside down and understanding it in a new way. And so we've made a habit of it. So we like use SIPS panels, which are kind of like classically used for residential or commercial construction, these kind of insulated panels for wall assemblies that are usually hidden. And at the University of Michigan, we did this project, Another Stack, which is taking those SIPS cuts and basically stacking them to create these kind of floating planes for people to assemble on. And the greatest success about that project, like it was very quick and it was just fun to do for this amazing Becoming Digital event that our colleagues at Michigan put together, Ellie Abrams and Adam Fury. But the payoff for the project, besides getting to see all our colleagues enjoy or not enjoy sitting on these very hard surfaces, was that a few months after we finished the project, we went to the website of the SIPS manufacturer, and we found that we had been slipped into their case studies. So you open this PDF, and there's like dozens and dozens and dozens of photos of all these kind of residential and commercial projects, which essentially take this really interesting, innovative product and put them in kind of cookie cutter normative situations. And then in the lower right corner, operating on 1% of the budget, is this funny, stupid furniture thing from Michigan. And for us, that was just such a sign of success, because it did speak a little bit to how we could kind of reprogram the perception of the thing, how we could be a little bit of a fly in the ointment, and how we could invite questions about how that thing is normally used and normally commodified and normally brought into the world. And so we've always looking for new opportunities to do that. And recently we've been doing it through these robotic paintings. And I give this long answer about these objects because I think effectively working with those technologies or working with these found things in the world produce a different type of authorship, right? Because we have to figure out what we can do with them, how can we respond to them. In the case of the SIPs, we had to talk to the SIPs manufacturers about doing things that they typically did for residential construction and what the limits and tolerances were. And it's the same thing for the robots now. The robots are designed to paint sports fields. And if you open up the software, you pick a field, and that's it. There's really nothing else to it. And so we had to understand how the G code for the machine is actually built. We had to understand how someone could go about programming for that robot. We had to understand its constraints. So its turning radius, if it turns left, is a centimeter. But if it turns right, it's 5 feet. And so you have to find all these different ways to respond to it. And there were limits to how much we could program. So if you actually look through the drawing fields projects that we did at Ragdale, the very first project is a series of like loops that look like an ice skater kind of skidded across this grounds. It's because we didn't know how to program the robot yet. We got the robot the day before the project was going to be installed. And so we were just doing test patterns, essentially wheelies with the robot, and we noticed it looked nice, and so we just manually drove it around the grounds. And so we just had to improvise. And then in each one, you'll see that the sophistication level grows as we grow more and more accustomed to what the robot can and can't do. And I think that's, it's a situation where we feel like it's a really fun way of working in a way that all architects work. We've all been to offices and seen the catalogs. Some of us really like the MasterCard catalog, and you look through these things. Somewhere out there, someone's made something in the world. They had a really clear intention about what it was to be used for. But it's usually the architects that are coming along and inventing new ways that those things can be used and beginning to kind of bend things. And so we really enjoy that type of work, and that's kind of become our form of authorship. So it's a little bit found object, a little bit about the expertise we have in-house. I'm not a great coder, but I know enough to be dangerous. It's these kind of things. And so it's resulted in a kind of informal, improvisational practice. And we like it because we see the richness in the ideas and in these kind of these uncanny acts of architecture, rather than seeking certain forms of perfection. I think that, looking back, a lot of the pavilion projects that were kind of the avant-garde and the peak of architecture when I was coming through school were these kind of fabrication projects, which were really about verticality. They were about substantiating and proving that these new technologies could build architecture. And it seems that the vertical was a kind of obsession there. And I think for us, a return to the horizontal is about, again, understanding that while the vertical plane might be really rich in terms of its ability to kind of communicate things, and it might be really rich for creating a kind of monumentality, we're really interested in the horizontal because it's a place where people walk and exist on, right? And so we're intensely interested in a way of prototyping architecture where we can understand spatial relationships really, really quickly. And so working on the ground is also there. But it's an interesting question that I think, besides those kind of interests, there's also this question about what are these paintings? Because paintings are actually, of course, typically vertical. Sometimes they're created horizontally, but they're still consumed vertically. And I think part of it might also have to do with the changing notion of perception. We have these drones now that are more and more and more, it's more and more normal to think about human vision as augmented. So, when we have like things like AR lenses or like drones, this expansion of human vision and our ability to understand that those are kind of part of us and accepting and naturalizing views that weren't naturalized before. There was always a criticism of, well, it's a bird's eye view, so it doesn't really give you advantage of how people see it. There is maybe like a larger appetite for kind of understanding how those modes of vision might change the way we design. So I think there's a little bit of relationship with that. But this is something we want to continue to explore. It's something we're writing with now. So we're reconciling the disciplinary question. At what point does this stop becoming a painting? And we're dealing with the question of how people gather. So we're using these spaces as kind of prototypes to understand. With the patterns, we're really interested in, there's different ways to understand programming, right? And for us, programming can be as simple as just a sloped surface, because the sloped surface dictates what can be done on the surface and what can't. And so for us, we see program a little bit more like that, where we're introducing these kind of fields and patterns where at times there's clear cues about what should be done or coded into them, like the basketball court on the current project. But in other times, hopefully, it's much more ambiguous about how the space should be used. And so when we did our second pattern at Ragdale, for example, a group of kids came and we went out into the backyard and we saw them running around, and I thought they were just running around randomly, but they had developed a game around the pattern. And they called this game Sport. And the idea was that based on the different pattern densities, those were areas that you could stand or where you couldn't, and they had this ball and they were playing this game. And for us, their capacity to improvise on the space and understand that it wasn't dictating any kind of conformity, but in fact it was inviting a response, is really rich and exciting. And that's something I hope we can continue to develop in the work. But it's a great question. But we love the ground, we love the horizontal, and we're curious about how we can expand our understanding of it. Helping a student understand like how that kind of form of authorship would be possible demands like that they have a certain kind of attentiveness to the world, right? And a certain kind of a stomach for not maybe doing things the way they've been done before. And I can think of like maybe two examples where we've pedagogically explored this a little bit more acutely. So a few years ago, we did a workshop series that was at the University of Milwaukee. And the theme was on play. And so we did a very small kind of workshop project where instead of giving the students like an advanced software or using kind of top of the line architectural products, we used basically the tool that you can use to like place furniture in your apartment from IKEA. And so the students took this AR software and stretched it to its absolute limits. So they pushed things to be as large as possible. They modified them, all just using the kind of user interface. And we talked a lot about the idea of the user manual and how the user manual is essentially gone. So when you used to get a piece of software, you'd get this kind of thick book where you'd have a big index of commands and you would look them up and try things. But now, instead of the education being based on the principles of how the software was developed, so the way the developer understands it, it's more about how the consumer understands it, because everything is understood through looking up YouTube videos. And when you look up these YouTube videos, you're not just using the nomenclature of the software. You're not saying like, how do I loft? You're saying things very specific, like how do I model a duck in Rhino, right? And so in this kind of environment where these very specific forms of knowledge are available, it becomes really important for students to understand how to find that knowledge, how to produce that knowledge, and how to work in that regime. Another thing that we've done with found objects is we're really interested in the notion of like using found software. So we've run a workshop. We ran one at the University of Miami in Ohio, and we're actually running one next week at the California College of the Arts. It's in coordination with the Drawing Codes show that's there that we have a piece in. And we're doing a project called Drawing a Field, which is about, basically we're facing this moment where we wanted to do a workshop. We're gonna have to do it remotely. And we wanted to know, like, how can we have the format of the workshop complement this moment completely and not look at it as a kind of like we didn't want the workshop to feel like it had been compromised in some way. So Drawing a Field, the students use Google Sheets, and they produce drawings within those Google Sheets, and then there's this intricate process of almost round robin passing the drawings from one group to another, where the students manipulate them with algorithms. And so essentially the workshop asks a lot of questions about how to take a kind of lowbrow software, like an easily accessible software like Google Sheets, and elevate what it does and how you can use it. And it also asks questions about new forms of collaboration, and also asks students to work a little bit more improvisationally, because instead of trying to produce one drawing, the students are actually developing a process. And that's a process that they carry out on multiple drawings over the course of the workshop. And so it demands a certain amount of improvisation, which I think also speaks a little bit more to this way of working. I think very early on I wanted to teach, and a lot of it was what I was alluding to earlier about just the great mentorship I was getting at Tennessee and observing the way some of my professors were able to work on really interesting projects, but also I really admired the time and the patience and the dedication they had to us as students. I also saw it as a kind of way to guarantee that most days would be different, So even though I might be teaching the same course a few different times at Ohio State, I'm always kind of tweaking the syllabus, trying new things, seeing what my peers are doing. I think it's if it's something that you want to do, I think it can be a really fantastic model for just really thriving off the energy of everything that's going on around you. So I do think the thing that's taken the longest is to understand how to embrace or navigate mistakes. And I think that I'm probably, as a younger designer, was very naive about, especially because we build so much of what we design, the translation from a representation, an instruction, an intention, and the object. And I think I used to have an ambition about shrinking that gap as much as possible. And I've discovered over time, and I'm still trying to teach myself more about this, that to thrive as an architect, you have to thrive in that gap. I mean, I think that we work with an understanding that in order to make things work in our current financial model, we will almost always have to fabricate something, right? And so I think that it has, over time, changed the way that we approach design projects, because I don't think we just don't design things that include details or materials that we could just never afford. And so from the very beginning, there is an intensity and an interest in thinking about how to bring it out into the world. And I think the paintings are kind of for us so far, the kind of apex of that, where if you compare the resources that are used, a little bit of energy, a little bit of paint, a pretty good amount of water, versus the kind of spatial impact we're able to make, there's an incredible kind of payoff there. And so I think that in some ways, one of the questions going forward in the practice is just to know how to translate that lesson into things with more permanence, right? Or it calls into question the ambition for permanence at all. So I think that maybe one thing that's going to be a legacy of the project is just more us looking at, and I mean, I just made this statement about mistakes. It's the same thing here where, I could, look at the project and say, well, it doesn't have that permanence, but then that's the mistake, because what I really should be thinking about is questioning permanence as a kind of core value in architecture. So, I think in terms of like what I want to do in the future, I think that you can sense maybe in the work like two kind of distinct things we're interested in. One is this notion of spaces for kind of collecting, spaces for gathering. And then the other side of the work is an interest in alternative residential typologies. And so I hope that we can, as a practice, continue to marry those ambitions, because I don't see them as separate in any way. And so I hope in the work we find ways to let each of those strains of research and kind of obsessions continue to inform each other. Because I think that, again, this idea of the intensity of the ground plane is an interest in how people use and consume and move around space, and at the same time married to the politics of boundaries and where someone can and can't go, and who feels invited to a place and who doesn't. And I think we have a lot to learn about that. And so I'd like to see us find ways to kind of thread the needle and make sure that all the work finds purchase in each of those areas.